Imagine you have a house guest. He showed up uninvited 16 years ago, ate all your food, broke your favorite vase, and oh yeah, systematically slaughtered roughly 20% of your adult male population. That house guest is Hannibal Barca, and Rome is the homeowner currently having a mental breakdown in the kitchen. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal had been running circles around the Roman legions in Italy, treating the Roman countryside like his personal Grand Theft Auto server. He was undefeated. He was terrifying. He was the boogeyman Roman mothers used to scare their kids into eating their vegetables. But by 202 BC, the game had changed. Rome had finally found a general who wasn't completely incompetent. Enter Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio, later known as Africanus, spoiler alert, realized that trying to fight Hannibal in Italy was a loser's game. So, he pulled a pro-gamer move. Instead of fighting the invader, Scipio decided to invade the invader's house. He sailed to North Africa, started burning things down, and forced Carthage to panic-dial Hannibal. Reluctantly, Hannibal left Italy. He landed in Africa, exhausted, with an army made up of tired veterans and whoever else he could scrape together. The stage was set at Zama, a dusty plain about 5 days' march from Carthage. But before the stabbing started, the 2 greatest generals of antiquity decided to do something incredibly rare. They had a chat. They met alone, with only interpreters. History tells us they stared at each other in silence for a while, mutually admiring the sheer awesomeness of the other person. It was the ancient equivalent of an intense anime stare-down. Hannibal, the old master, tried to negotiate a peace treaty to save Carthage from destruction. Scipio, the young prodigy, essentially looked at the terms, laughed, and said, "Yeah, no, we're doing this the hard way." Negotiations had failed, the talking was over, it was time for violence. The sun rose over Zama and both generals started arranging their human chess pieces. But looking at the lineups, it was clear that Hannibal was working with a bit of a garage sale army. Hannibal organized his infantry into 3 distinct lines. The first line was the mercenaries, Gauls, Ligurians, and Balearic slingers, basically the guys who were only there for the paycheck. The second line was the Carthaginian citizens' local levies who had spent most of the war sitting on their couches eating figs. They were terrified. But the third line? That was the scary part. That was Hannibal's old guard, the veterans from Italy. These guys had marched over the Alps, survived the snow, and killed Romans for sport for 15 years. They were the Terminators of the ancient world. However, Hannibal's real ace in the hole stood right at the front. 80 war elephants. 80. That is a terrifying amount of angry. Stomping biology. These weren't the well-trained beasts of his early campaigns. These were freshly caught, barely trained North African forest elephants who were probably wondering why everyone was shouting. On the other side, Scipio was doing something weird. Roman legions usually fought in a checkerboard pattern called the quincunx. It was solid, flexible, and had worked for 100 years. But today, Scipio looked at the checkerboard and said, nah. He arranged his troops in straight columns, leaving wide, empty lanes running straight through his army. Scipio also had one other nasty surprise. For the first time ever, the Romans had better cavalry. Thanks to the Numidian King Masinissa switching sides, a classic top 10 anime Betrayals moment, Rome now had the elite horsemen that used to win battles for Hannibal. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd been flipped over and set on fire. Hannibal checked his watch, which was a sundial taped to his wrist, and decided it was time to crush some Romans. He raised his hand and gave the signal. The 80 war elephants roared a sound that usually caused enemy soldiers to soil their armor instantly and began their thundering charge. It should have been a massacre. Elephants are essentially living tanks with anger management issues, but Scipio had prepared for this moment. He knew that for all their size, elephants are skittish creatures who really hate loud noises. Scipio nodded to his velites, the light infantry skirmishers. "Now," he shouted, "play the song of your people." Suddenly, hundreds of Roman trumpeters and hornblowers stepped forward and blasted the loudest, most discordant noise in history. It wasn't music, it was pure acoustic violence. The result was immediate chaos. The elephants on the wings panic spiraled. Terrified by the noise, they slammed on the brakes, did a U-turn, and stampeded straight back into their own cavalry. Hannibal watched in horror as his own heavy beasts trampled his horsemen on the left flank. "You had one job," he screamed, presumably. But the elephants in the center kept charging. They thundered toward the Roman infantry, ready to turn the legions into paste. But then, they saw something weird. Open hallways. Thanks to Scipio's column formation, there were clear, inviting paths running straight through the Roman army. Being animals, the elephants took the path of least resistance. Instead of smashing into a wall of shields, they just jogged harmlessly down the lanes. The terrifying charge ended with the elephants exiting out the back of the Roman formation, having accomplished absolutely nothing other than getting some cardio. Scipio dusted off his shoulder pads. Step 1 was complete. With the elephants now enjoying a lovely jog into the countryside, things went from bad to worse for Hannibal's flanks. Remember those elephants that panicked and U-turned? They had slammed right into the Carthaginian cavalry, turning their formation into a mosh pit of confused horses and concussed riders. Masinissa, the Numidian prince turned Roman fanboy, saw his chance. He looked at Laelius, the commander of the Roman cavalry, and gave a nod that said, "Let's get 'em, boys." The Roman and Numidian cavalry charged. The Carthaginian horsemen, already disoriented by their own elephants playing bumper cars with them, broke almost immediately. They turned tail and fled the battlefield. Masinissa and Laelius, intoxicated by the thrill of the chase, and possibly too much espresso, galloped after them, disappearing over the horizon. This was great for Rome's stats, but it had a weird side effect. The cavalry was gone, both sides. The battlefield, which moments ago was full of tromping beasts and galloping horses, was now just empty on the sides. It was just two massive blocks of infantry staring at each other across the hot sand. Hannibal watched his cavalry vanish into the distance. For 15 years, cavalry had been his superpower. It was how he won at Cannae, it was how he won at Trebia. Now, he was standing there like a kid whose bicycle had just been stolen. "Well," Hannibal likely muttered, tightening his belt, "I guess we're doing this the old-fashioned way, stabbing." With the horses gone, Scipio ordered his infantry forward. The Roman front line, the Hastati young men, eager to prove they weren't total screw-ups, slammed into Hannibal's first line of mercenaries. The clash was brutal. It was the sound of thousands of shields smashing together, like a heavy metal concert where the mosh pit is made of iron and bad intentions. Hannibal's mercenaries, Gauls, Ligurians, and Balearic warriors actually fought surprisingly well. They knew that if they lost, they weren't getting their paycheck, and nothing motivates a freelancer like an overdue invoice. They held the Romans back for a while, trading blows and shouting insults about each other's mothers. But eventually, the superior discipline and better protein intake of the Roman legions began to push the mercenaries back. Battered and bleeding, the mercenaries did the logical thing. They tried to retreat through the second line of Carthaginian citizen troops to regroup. But the citizens? They just stood there. The Carthaginian citizens, terrified that the Romans would follow the retreating mercenaries and break their formation, refused to open ranks. They locked their shields and blocked their own allies. The mercenaries, realizing they were trapped between angry Romans in the front and useless teammates in the back, completely lost it. They felt betrayed. So, in a fit of rage, the mercenaries started hacking at the Carthaginian citizens to force their way through. Suddenly, Hannibal's army was fighting itself. It was the ultimate hostile work environment. The Romans paused for a second, confused, watching their enemies kill each other, before shrugging and stabbing whoever was closest. It was total anarchy, and Scipio was loving every second of it. With Hannibal's first two lines effectively participating in a chaotic mosh pit of friendly fire, Scipio saw an opening. He ordered his Hastati, who were now covered in gore and looking like extras from a slasher movie, to press the advantage. The Roman machine ground forward. The mercenaries were crushed. The Carthaginian citizens, who had spent the last 10 minutes fighting their own employees, were suddenly face to face with the Roman legions. It turns out that being an accountant with a spear doesn't make you a warrior. They fought desperately, but they were cut down where they stood. By now, the ground was a nightmare. It was slippery with blood, piled high with bodies, and littered with discarded weapons. The Roman Hastati were exhausted. Their swords were dull, their arms were jelly, and they were panting like pugs in a sauna. Scipio looked ahead. Waiting for them, completely untouched and fresh as daisies, was Hannibal's third line. The veterans, the old guard, the guys who ate nails for breakfast. They hadn't moved an inch. They just stood there, watching the slaughter with the cold, dead eyes of people who have seen too much. If the disorganized, tired Romans tried to climb over the mounds of bodies to attack the veterans, they would be slaughtered. Scipio knew this. So he did something you almost never see in the middle of a battle fever dream. He called a timeout. Scipio ordered his men to drag the bodies aside, clear the ground, and reform their lines. He rotated his tired hastati to the back and brought his fresh principes and triarii to the front. It was a tactical pit stop. He was changing his tires before the final lap. The battlefield was now eerily quiet. The bodies had been moved, mostly. The dust had settled. Two single lines of infantry stood facing each other. On one side, Scipio's reformed legions, determined to end this war. On the other, Hannibal's veterans, the invincible ghosts of Italy, determined to save their city. This was it. No tricks, no elephants, no terrain advantages, just a straight up, old school, my dad can beat up your dad fist fight. Scipio shouted the order. Hannibal shouted the order. The two lines surged forward and collided with a sound like a thunderclap inside a library. The fighting was savage. These were the best soldiers in the world. The Roman discipline met the Carthaginian experience head on. Neither side gave an inch. It was a grinder. Men fell, and others stepped over them to fill the gap. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly evenly matched. Hannibal's veterans were fighting like demons. They knew if they lost here, Carthage burned. They pushed the Romans back, step by agonizing step. Scipio watched anxiously. His infantry was holding, but only just. The invincible legion myth was starting to crack. He looked toward the horizon, squinting into the dust. "Where is that damn cavalry?" he muttered, checking his sundial watch again. Did they stop for drive-through? The Romans were beginning to waver. The sheer ferocity of Hannibal's old guard was breaking them. If something didn't happen soon, the history books were going to have a very different ending. The Roman line was bending. It was bending like a cheap plastic spoon in a tub of frozen ice cream. Hannibal's veterans were relentless, pushing forward with the desperate strength of men who knew this was the end of the line. Hannibal, watching from the back, cracked a smile. He was doing it. He was actually going to pull off the impossible again. He was about to defeat Rome's golden boy with a scrapyard army and a handful of angry elephants. But just as the Romans were about to break, a low rumble started. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't elephants, it sounded like thousands of hooves hitting the dirt at maximum velocity. Every head on the battlefield turned. On the horizon, a massive cloud of dust appeared. Emerging from the cloud, looking like the riders of Rohan but with better tans, were Masinissa and Laelius. They hadn't ridden off into the sunset, they had just gone to chase the bad guys away and were now returning for the main event. Hannibal's smile vanished faster than free pizza in a break room. The Roman and Numidian cavalry didn't slow down. They thundered across the plain and smashed directly into the rear of Hannibal's veteran line. Crunch. It was the classic hammer and anvil tactic, the exact same move Hannibal had used to destroy the Romans at Cannae. Now, in a cruel twist of irony, it was being used against him. The Carthaginian veterans, attacked from the front by Scipio and from behind by Masinissa, were trapped. The battle turned instantly from a contest of skill into a mosh pit of doom. The circle was complete. The encirclement was tight, and the irony was thicker than the dust choking the soldiers. For his entire career, Hannibal had been the master of the double envelopment. It was his signature move. It was the move that made him a legend. And now, Scipio Africanus, a man who had studied Hannibal's battles like a fanboy reading comic books, was using that exact same move to crush him. The Carthaginian veterans fought to the end because, well, they didn't have much of a choice. They were surrounded by angry Romans in front and stabbing horses in the back, but the cohesion shattered. The invincible army dissolved into a panic. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a liquidation sale. About 20,000 Carthaginians were killed. Another 20,000 were captured to be sold as slaves, or unpaid interns as the Roman economy called them. The ground of Zama was soaked red. Hannibal, realizing that the server was shutting down and he had lost the game, decided it was time to rage quit. He didn't stay to die with his men like a captain going down with the ship. No, he was too pragmatic for that. He grabbed a horse and bolted. He rode non-stop to Hadrumetum, leaving the wreck of his army behind. The greatest general of his generation had been bested not by luck, but by a Roman who had simply learned the lesson better than the teacher. Scipio stood amidst the carnage, wiped his blade, and probably made a cool one-liner that was lost to history. Rome had won. The nightmare was over. Hannibal arrived back in Carthage, covered in dust and defeat. The Carthaginian Senate, who had spent the war arguing over tax brackets while Hannibal did all the work, looked at him expectantly. They were hoping for a "don't worry, I have a secret plan" speech. Instead, Hannibal looked them dead in the eye and effectively said, "It's over. We lost. Fold the hand." Scipio's terms for peace were, to put it mildly, a total ripoff. Carthage had to hand over all its warships except for 10, basically enough to start a small rowing club. They had to pay a massive indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver, which took them 50 years to pay off. They had to give up Spain, the Mediterranean islands, and all their elephants. But the kicker? They couldn't wage war on anyone, even in self-defense, without Rome's permission. Carthage was no longer a superpower. It was a client state. It was Rome's grounded teenager. Scipio returned to Rome and threw the biggest party the city had ever seen, a triumph. He was given the agnomen, Africanus. He was the hero who had saved the Republic from the brink of extinction. He was the main character of the ancient world. As for Hannibal, he tried to become a politician. Weird, career pivot. Actually did a good job fixing Carthage's economy, but the Romans got paranoid and chased him into exile. Years later, rather than be captured, he took poison in a ring, getting the last laugh by denying Rome the satisfaction of executing him. The Battle of Zama didn't just end a war, it ended an era. The Mediterranean was no longer a contest, it was a Roman lake. Rome had survived its darkest nightmare and emerged as an unstoppable juggernaut that would dominate the world for the next 600 years. Rome had learned that it could bleed, but it could not be killed. And the rest of the world, well, they were about to find out exactly what that meant.